In New York.
Since the congestion pricing plan has been announced, there has been outrage from people across New York and New Jersey, as well as one group called Reclaim New York. They are pushing back against the legislation and claiming for it to be repealed. Joining me now to discuss their plan and how to get involved, as well as spokesperson for the Reclaim initiative, Jadan Horyn. Jadan, thank you for being here.
Yeah, pleasure.
Let's first talk about congestion pricing as a whole. Are you against the concept, or are you against how it's being applied and put into practice here in New York?
I mean, the theory of congestion pricing is great. So it is predicated on the idea that if we charge people to enter an area during specific periods of time, we can reduce congestion. So that's the theory. But that's not how it's applied in New York. And because that's not how it's applied in New York, that's what we're against. We're against the fact that it's been applied essentially to raise revenue for the MTA with zero reform for the MTA, and none of the issues of actual congestion that have been caused by the city and poor planning have been addressed.
Well, we actually have a list here of some of the concerns that you have. If you can just detail them for us here as they come up on screen. Have you seen, does this concern you that you don't have the details as far as pricing is concerned as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think New Yorkers should have transparency from their government of what the costs are going to be when they're going to be bearing, the studies that came out suggested that tolls need to be an additional $11, and that could go as high as $24. I mean, that is a big range, and it is already expensive to enter Manhattan on the bridges and tunnels. It would drive up the cost for people that live in the city, but also for people that live in the suburbs.
What is your concern about the hand-picked panel that will be deciding this?
Let's talk about the hand-picked panel. We have an issue with the fact that once again, our governor and our state legislature have delegated away accountability to a commission, a panel, a board, and they punted implementation of this until after the 2020 election, which means that when people feel it, their elected officials won't be held to the fire. And because it's in a panel, that means we can do what we did with the PACB, where they decide perhaps they don't like the Amazon deal, and then the governor says, wait, hold on, we need to change that law because we don't want that independent panel to have that much power. But we also want the independent panel to have power, so we don't have to be responsible for the consequences of our legislative actions.
So you've heard, people in the government, especially Governor Cuomo, say that it has worked in other places. There's been legitimate studies done in other cities around the world. Do you feel like that's lacking here?
Absolutely. So it has been implemented in London, Stockholm, Sweden, and Singapore. But let's take London, for example. Okay. It's a similar population to New York. Their congestion pricing roughly runs 11.5 pounds. It's like something like $16. But it runs Monday through Friday during the day from 7 to 6 p.m. It does not run 24/7. It was not designed as a revenue-making measure for their transit system. It was designed to reduce endemic congestion in London, in central London, and it has worked to varying degrees. At the same time, though, that's not at all what New York's congestion pricing was designed as. There were no studies done. Let's be clear. This was combined with a budget bill in order to cajole the votes together and in order to minimize any type of scrutiny, and on top of that, to really force legislators who know this is against the interests of their constituents to swallow this poison pill. But really, honestly, the poison is being swallowed by New Yorkers who have to pay it, and that's the scam.
Would it make you feel better to know that the money was going to fix roads versus the MTA subway bus system?
It would make me better to know that, first and foremost, if they can push a bill through at 2:45 a.m. or change time to say that it wasn't 2:45, that they could push through MTA reform first instead of making a plan. It would make me feel good if I knew that, in fact, the money was dedicated to improving transit in the city, that the money was dedicated to improving roads and transportation. But it doesn't make me feel good that New Yorkers have to pay more for what they already have and what they didn't have to pay for. So essentially they have to pay more for what was once free, and they're getting nothing additional out of it except promises. And look, in 2009 we got promises of a payroll tax, dedicated funding for MTA, and 10 years later, all the same problems, nothing new other than more trains that aren't on time, more breakdowns, and ridership falling for the first time in years when our city's population has grown.
So this budget now has been passed. So when you say that you want it to be repealed, can that actually be done?
It can be done. The legislature's still sitting. The governor, he wants to rail against the president's wall, but he's now built one around Manhattan, and we think it's wrong. And
What should people do?
People should contact their legislators. They need to contact Senator Andrea Stewart-Cousins. She's the Senate Majority Leader, and let her know. She lives in Westchester, and this whole idea was predicated on splitting opposition. It was against splitting the city against the suburbs, Assembly Democrats against the newly elected Senate Democrats, and riders against drivers. And we just disagree with the notion of division. We think that if congestion pricing should and ought to be implemented, and that our legislators believe it should be, that they do real studies, that they slow down, they repeal this, they do it correctly, they're transparent with the public, and then they have public opinion behind them.
So you're essentially saying that this is a tax on the middle class?
It's a tax on the middle class, a tax on everyone. Okay. Everyone's being screwed by this.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. It will be something that we will certainly be following.